Aliens? The power of language in a science fiction movie? You have my attention. Hi, my name is Kyrie and welcome to Flights of Fantasy, the show where we look at different fantasy and science fiction movies and ask, what do they mean? Today we're going to be looking at 2016's Arrival. Arrival is directed by Denis Villeneuve, who we'll see again when we cover 2017's Blade Runner 2049, and when we cover the 2021 Dune remake. I'm very excited about that. Arrival stars Amy Adams as Louise Banks, a linguistic professor who has to navigate, international politics and also communicating with aliens. So what does it all mean? Why is this movie so sad? And what exactly does it mean when aliens invade? Let's take off and find out. We begin with a series of scenes, presumably a montage of the life of Louise Banks, our main character, up until now. She speaks about the strangeness of memory and time in a voiceover.
Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't work like I thought it did. We are so bound by time. By its order.
She takes her newborn daughter Hannah from a nurse's arms, and we see Hannah as an older child playing with Louise, a rebellious teenager fighting with Louise, and finally as a young adult who dies due to cancer. In the present, we cut to Louise, who is arriving to work at a university as a linguistics professor. But something strange is happening. Everyone is around TVs, and after a couple of rude cell phone interruptions in her class, she finally turns on the news herself, and it is a thing. A giant extraterrestrial thing has landed in Montana, and it's one of 12 that have landed all across the globe. Back at home, thanks to a phone call with her mother and really good framing, we get a sense of just how lonely Louise's life really is. That night, the first of many newscasts we'll see in this movie, gives us a sense of just how panicked the world is getting over just the presence of these spaceships, which, fair. But Louise doesn't really seem to pay much mind. She goes back to work until a military man played by Forrest Whitaker comes into her office. His name is Colonel G.T. Weber, and apparently he and Louise have worked together before on a top secret mission where she translated some things and people died as a result, so the relationship between them is pretty frosty as it is. Colonel Weber plays an audio recording of humans asking the aliens questions, and the aliens respond, although not in a way that you or I or really any human could understand. Colonel Weber asks Louise to translate it. How does he even start to translate it? Louise tells him that's not really possible unless she's in the room. Colonel Weber tells her that's impossible, it's not gonna happen, and even threatens to go get a different linguist to figure this out instead. Before he goes though, Louise tells him to ask the other linguistic about the Sanskrit word for war and its translation. Colonel Weber leaves without another word, and it's unclear whether or not he's actually gonna do it. Except early the next morning, he's back at her doorstep with a chopper and a couple of troops ready to take her to Montana. When Louise asks what the other linguist said about the Sanskrit word for war and its translation, he said something along the lines of a disagreement or an argument, where Louise's translation is a desire for more cows. So Louise is clearly more detail-oriented and understands the nuance of language and how important it is to get it right. On the plane to the site in Montana, we meet Ian Donnelly, played by Jeremy Renner, who is going to be her new theoretical physicist partner.
Yeah, it's great, even if it's wrong.
It's wrong.
Well, the cornerstone of civilization isn't language, it's science.
Ian is a theoretical physicist from...
Our first impression? Oh boy. Working together, their mission is to figure out who the aliens are and what the heck they want. The soundtrack as they approach the base camp is really ominous and otherworldly and just sounds disjointed and wrong. Combined with a striking visual of just how large the shuttle is, it dwarfs the base camp and even dwarfs the Montana mountains behind it. Louise and Ian are checked in, vaccinated, and led to what is essentially a worldwide Zoom call of all of the different sites that are trying to pool their knowledge together about what they know about these aliens, which isn't much, isn't really anything. Different sites are using different methods to communicate with their aliens. We're also told that none of the sites can make physical contact with these beings for reasons we'll see later. A siren goes off, and it's time to head up to the shuttle. Here's the way it works. Every 18 hours or so, a hatch at the bottom of the shuttle opens up, which allows the humans to be craned in. The aliens need this time in order to create a livable atmosphere for the humans to enjoy while they're staying as guests. How sweet. They're craned up into the shaft of the shuttle, and the gravity shifts about midway through, so where instead of a vertical shaft, it is a horizontal shaft. The way they managed to pull this off visually is kind of cool. At the end of what is now a long hallway is this massive room that's basically made out of rock. In the middle of the room is this giant, thick wall of glass with this ominous white fog or smoke behind it. The crew sets up their different equipment: video, audio, radioactivity. They even have a canary set in the room, which kind of gives us a really ominous vibe, because that's all we hear for a little while, this canary chirping as they wait for the creatures to arrive. And when they do arrive, it's with this low, bass, bone-rattling noise. Combined with creepy sound design and soundtrack, it makes for a pretty creepy entrance as these creatures emerge from the fog. We see Louise, take a breath, get ready, and then we cut to immediately after, where they're listening to the sounds that they recorded during this encounter. She wasn't able to do much because it's clear that she is not going to be able to speak their language, and it's not very likely that they're going to be able to speak ours. There's going to have to be another way to communicate. The news that night shows that the world is taking this great. No, they're not. There is mass riots, there is mass suicide cults, and just overall calamity. The next go, Louise has the idea to bring in a handy-dandy whiteboard. She writes human and motions towards herself. For a second, it looks like the aliens are going to retreat, but when they come back, they end up shooting out this inky sand-like material from one of their tentacles, and it makes this strange-looking circle with a bunch of different knobs and branches. And this is huge, because the aliens have a written language. We can work with this. But as Louise and company come back through decontamination, Colonel G.T. Weber has some concerns, like why teach them our language, why not just talk to them? He's thinking about it tactically and more, the less information that we give them, the better for us in case we have to come to blows. So then Louise tells him about the kangaroo. So way back when, this guy Captain Cook and his crew runs aground on the shores of Australia. They run into some Aborigines people, and they see this animal that hops around, and one of the sailors points to the animal and says, "What is that?" One of the Aborigines say, "Kangaroo." They didn't realize until later that kangaroo means "I don't understand." Louise's main point here is that if she can teach them the basics and get an accurate translation, it'll make the deconstruction of their language a lot simpler, and it'll make overall communication a lot faster. The Colonel buys it too. And see, the thing about this story is that it's not true. But it proves her point, so Louise is not above telling a lie to get to where she needs to be. Back at camp that night, the International Zoom Wall of Nerds talks about how the aliens can't do basic math, but they can solve really complex theoretical equations. It's definitely weird. We also learn about General Sheng in China. He's also known as the Domino, because if China attacks their shuttle, other countries are sure to follow. And that's not good. Louise comes up with a vocabulary list of sorts that they want the aliens to respond to. The Colonel and a couple of the other governmental officials are really skeptical of this, so Louise breaks down why they're going to do things her way. She breaks down the nature of a simple question: what is your purpose? By the time she's done, her case is made pretty soundly. The alarm goes off and it's time to go back up into the shuttle. This time around, Louise writes down her own name, indicates to her. But it's clear that the aliens aren't identifying her as an individual, which is fair because these giant orange hazmat suits make all of the humans look identical. So Louise says screw it. She takes off her hazmat suit and approaches the glass. She holds up her hand.
Now that's a proper introduction.
It's an interesting interspecies point of connection, one that exceeds the communication barrier. Ian, seeing this, also says screw it and takes off his hazmat suit. Louise writes down his name and they indicate towards him. And in return, each of the aliens shoots out a different sandy, inky circle in front of them. And voila! The aliens have names. The aliens can identify individuals. But given that we can't read those names, Ian opts to call them Abbott and Costello. Back at the camp, Louise isn't feeling great. She keeps imagining Hannah looking at something. The camp doctor says that there's no sign of radiation poisoning yet, so Colonel Weber agrees and they will continue on with what they've been doing. The world, meanwhile, is not handling being in the dark about these aliens very well at all. To illustrate this, we see a soldier on the phone with his wife. Let's call the soldier Chekhov. Chekhov's wife is crying and panicking and saying how scared she and their child are for him. Louise studies the symbols that they received that day, and she has visions of Hannah in a meadow, looking at a caterpillar, drawing circles on a stream with a stick. She tries to continue on with her work. And then we get an info dump! Woohoo! In a voiceover, Ian tells us about the things that they do and do not know about the aliens. What they don't know? Most things. They don't know what the spaceship is made out of. They don't know if the spaceships can communicate between each other. They don't know why they're here. They don't know why they chose to land where they did. But we do know a couple of things about them. They're called heptapods because they have 7 tentacles. What they say and what they write don't really have a correlation. Ian says that linguists would call this language nonlinear orthography. So basically, instead of listening to sounds coming out of somebody's mouth and then identifying each of those sounds as a word, and then stringing together those words to form a sentence, and then deriving meaning of what they're trying to say as the sentence as a whole, instead of all that, the heptapods simply write everything that they mean into one picture that you're supposed to perceive simultaneously. It's kind of hard to wrap your brain around, to be honest, but it is extremely similar to the Tralfamadorian novels from the book Slaughterhouse Five. More on Slaughterhouse Five in a minute. Throughout this montage info dump, they have a goal of expanding on their vocabulary, and we see that some time, at least months, have passed. And then we smash cut to the news. A photo of the heptapods was leaked, and humanity is not taking that very well. We even see our soldier, Chekhov, listening to this inflammatory, conspiracy-type commentator saying how we need a show of force to take back our country, you know, that kind of rhetoric. Louise in particular is definitely feeling the strain of being overworked. We see more flashes of her and Hannah, where Hannah is showing her a picture called the Mommy and Daddy Show, which she knows is just pretend because Mommy and Daddy are not together anymore. Flashes of Hannah's illness and her death. It's overwhelming her. She talks to Ian about how she needs more sleep. For a moment, they talk about the Waldorf theory, which is basically that the language you speak shapes how you see the world. We hear this canary chirping in the background as Ian asks Louise if she's been dreaming in their language yet. She admits that she has, and then when she looks up to see him, he has been replaced with a heptapod that's there and making this low, bassy, rumbling noise, and she's dreaming, as it turns out. When she wakes up, the Colonel has her listen to a phone call of General Shang that they've intercepted through satellite. He says that each shuttle is offering advanced technology, and that their scientists are working to decode the sets. Remember how I said that different sites are using different methods of communication? Louise realizes that the Chinese have been using a game to communicate with their heptapods, in particular, mahjong. So what's the problem with that? Well, Louise explains it like this. If she had taught the heptapods to communicate through chess, every interaction would be framed through a lens of opposition. There'd be a winner and a loser, victory and defeat. If all I gave you was a hammer,
Everything's a nail.
this likely means that while the Chinese may have translations of what their heptapods are saying, due to the framing of the conversation, it may be way more combative than either side intends it to be. So Louise heads up back to the shuttle. They've developed a tablet where Louise can type out what she wants to say, and it will translate that into one of the heptapod circles and project it, which is really cool. Costello, the bigger of the two heptapods, sends out a circle that translates into "to offer weapon." We see them back at camp trying to understand what exactly this means. We don't know if they know what weapon means to us. We don't know if it's a trade. We don't know what exactly their intention is. China and Russia have gone off the grid since whatever the heptapods have said during their last session. And because of that, the United States follows. And one by one, we see each of the countries on the international Zoom call sign off. Global communication has effectively died. It's a news report that tells us that the Chinese received the message, "use weapon." General Shang no longer trusts the aliens, and it's starting to look like humanity, super out of character, might do something drastic. Our boy Chekhov has set up bombs inside the alien's room that will go off in 10 minutes. Louise and Ian rush up to the shuttle with only 4 minutes left on the clock. She asks, "Offer weapon?" ? Costello shoots back a circle that translates into a series of words. Visitors, friends, offer, technology. Louise sends back, "Give technology now." Abbott, the skinnier of the two heptapods, taps the glass. Meanwhile, the soldiers outside of the shuttle, including Chekhov, are arming up, and they are prepared to make sure that their plan to bomb this shuttle goes off without any interruption from the rest of the camp. Abbott taps on the glass again, and then sticks his hand up to it. Louise has a vision of her daughter as a baby, and then she also raises her hand. And then, on different sides of the glass, they make a circle out of that ink. It's a pretty cool scene. Suddenly, Costello runs away like a squid, releasing this giant cloud of ink. Abbott stays, and inside of this cloud of ink, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of circles. Louise and Ian hear the gunshots from outside, and the bomb is about to go off. Abbott slams his tentahand against the glass, and gravity shifts. Colonel Weber watches the explosion from the base in horror. Louise wakes up groggy at the base. She and Ian are okay, but the base is no longer secure and they're going to evacuate soon. Louise insists that they need to stay. They need to explain that what happened wasn't their intention or their fault. Something that sounds like thunder cracks outside, and the shuttle ends up raising a significant amount. Later that night, we discover that China is preparing to destroy their shuttle. The United States and the rest of the world even are preparing to attack their shuttles also, in order to prevent a retaliatory attack. Louise and Ian pour through the symbols, trying to figure out what exactly they all mean, and Ian has found something. The symbol for time is everywhere. So what does that mean? They realize that they only have 1/12 of what the heptapods are trying to communicate. 1/12, that's awfully specific, almost like there were 12 shuttles that landed on Earth. Louise tries to convince the big government kids that they need to cooperate with the other nations in order to understand what the heptapods are really trying to say. Bad Military Man rejects that idea outright. You see, they pulled audio off of a Russian scientist satellite call, and it said, quote, "The aliens said, 'There is no time. Many become one. I fear we have all become weapons.'" The scientist in the call is cut off by a roar of gunshots, and it is clear that he died to give this information to the world. Ian suggests that they offer up their information in exchange for everyone else's information, a non-zero-sum game. As Ian tries to convince the government people that they can communicate with the other nations through the shuttles, Louise goes off on her own to the shuttle, as if called to it. A smaller transporter shuttle of sorts descends from the big boy, and she is shuttled up alone. For the first time ever, she's on the other side of the glass. It's hard to breathe, everything sounds like it's underwater, and Louise can see one of the heptapods moving through the fog like it's a shark. Louise identifies this one as Costello, and she asks where Abbott is. Costello shoots out an inky, sandy circle which floats in front of her. Caption for us says, "Abbott is death process." The remarkable implication here is that Louise understands his written language, and Costello understands her spoken words. They're able to communicate fluidly in this otherworldly space. Louise apologizes for Abbott and asks Costello to send a message to the other sites, but Costello sends out another circle, and it says, "Louise has weapon, use weapon." But Louise doesn't understand. She asks Costello for its purpose here. Costello responds in a couple of circles, "We help humanity. In 3,000 years, we need humanity's help." Louise asks how it can know the future. The creature makes a loud, rumbling noise in response, and Louise can see Hannah as a little girl. Louise says she doesn't understand. And then she asks, "Who is this child?" And there's the gut punch. We see Hannah's picture of her parents. In that picture is the canary, and Hannah even makes these heptapod lookalikes from Play-Doh. Louise sees future, Costello writes. There's another flash of Hannah. Weapon opens time. Costello floats away into the mist. We see a future Louise looking around. We then see present Louise being ejected from the shuttle, which is turning parallel to the Earth. She's disoriented and is ushered back to the SUVs by Ian and the Colonel. A flash of Hannah missing her shoe interrupts Louise's thoughts. Hannah asks Louise if she will leave her the same way that her father did. Louise doesn't understand because Hannah's going to see her father this weekend. Hannah clarifies that her dad doesn't look at her the same way anymore, which is pretty deep for a kid, but okay. Louise explains that it's her fault, that she told him something that he wasn't ready to hear yet. Hannah asks what it was, and Louise explains that she knows that something is going to happen, and that when she told Hannah's father, he said that she made the wrong choice. Hannah asks what is going to happen. Louise says that it has something to do with a really rare disease, and it's something that's unstoppable, kind of like Hannah with her poetry and her swimming, and with all the amazing things that Hannah is bringing to the world. Hannah is unstoppable. Back in the present, a woozy Louise says that she understands why somebody left her, which is said in more of a mumble, so Ian is like, okay. Ian gets her into the SUV, and on the news we see that all around the world, all the shuttles are turning horizontal to the Earth, and they're getting closer to the Earth too. Between shots of Louise at a bustling, evacuating base, we see a future her opening a box full of books that she will one day write. In a way that seems like she's aware and also able to control these switches in time, she realizes she can read the language perfectly now, and she understands what the weapon is. It's not a weapon at all, it's a gift. And the gift is their language. Because if you learn it and truly understand it, you will perceive time the same way that the heptapods do, which is not linear at all. Louise tries to explain this newfound revelation to the Colonel, but he's too busy trying to evacuate a base here, so he's not going to be much help. Louise then jumps to a point in the near future, at some sort of ball. General Shang, the Domino, approaches her, and he's come all this way just to meet her. He says in English that 18 months ago, she did something that no one has been able to do. Changed his mind. Apparently, she reached out to him on his private number. He gives it to her and says that he gets the sense that it's very important that she sees it now. In the present, she re-enters a base that is quickly being deassembled and steals a satellite phone. And it turns out the phone that she stole was actually Mr. Bad Military Man's phone. So now they're on the hunt for her. 18 months in the future, General Shang leans in close and tells Louise that she told him his wife's dying words, a phrase in Chinese that we don't get the translation for. Ian and Louise go into the quarantine room. In there, with guns trained on both her and Ian shields her from view with his own body while Louise talks on the phone in Chinese. And then it's it. She's done. In a flurry of news channels, we see that General Shang has changed his mind, and China will be sharing its information from the heptapods with the other nations. The shuttles turn once again, back to a vertical position. They break through the clouds and leave, almost as if disappearing in clouds of ink. Then everything goes to black. Back to the present, the military helicopter holding her and Ian takes off. We hear her say in voiceover, "So Hannah, this is where your story begins, the day they departed." Ian comforts Louise. We see more heartbreaking moments of Louise with an out-of-focus husband, and we see him come into focus. In a montage of moments, we cut between the Louise that is drinking wine outside of the house in the opening shot, between the one who is passing a baby off to her husband, and one that is spelling out Hannah with her daughter. They all converge when we realize that this father is Ian. We see Louise look at Ian in the present. The two look on to the Montana mountain range, and as Ian looks up at the stars, he remarks how the most remarkable thing hasn't been meeting the heptapods, it's been meeting Louise. We see flashes of them throughout Louise's future life in love, and present Louise hugs him the way that she's going to hug him in the future, and then the movie cuts to black and ends. Humans have always been afraid of something or someone bigger and stronger than them coming in and destroying their way of life. The alien invasion trope, as we know it today, where aliens come to Earth and humanity has to try to fight them off, was popularized and some would say created by H.G. Wells in his novel The War of the Worlds. The War of the Worlds itself was a variation upon invasion literature, which up until then was most well known for Great Britain being invaded by whoever they were most at odds at the time. Looking at you, pre-World War I Germany, and then France, and then Germany again. Basically, there's a lot more blatant xenophobia in invasion literature. So that's where the foundation of the alien invasion as we know it comes from. But what does it actually mean? And the answer to that is, it depends. The meaning varies depending on the current state of affairs, but generally it's an allegory for whatever's going on with humanity at the time. For instance, post-World War II invasion literature focused a lot on communism, Russia, China, you know, the big red scare. Ooh. It makes sense to me then that throughout the Cold War, alien invasion was extremely common in the United States science fiction realm. It illustrated the fears of foreign, that is, Russian, occupation. In general, when you see aliens, you should be asking, what does this tell me about humanity? And when you see alien invasion, you should be asking, what does this tell me about how humanity sees itself? When aliens invade, we can derive further meaning based on what the aliens actually do. They can come for an outright and direct war with humanity, a la Independence Day. They can go for a more sneaky approach, where they're observing, or maybe they're experimenting, or maybe they're even controlling or replacing people. Communism, what are you doing here? Get out of here! And rarely, the aliens come to help. So there's this phrase you may have heard of called the white man's burden. It's this racist poem written by a racist dude that was defending the United States' colonialization of the Philippines at the time. It proposes that white people have the moral obligation to spread their culture to the rest of the world, to those poor, non-white people. Because after all, us white people, we're civilized. And it's up to us white people to know better and know what's best for the non-white people of the world. And we will give them our culture, even if they never wanted it or never asked for it. It's our burden. But like, what's that got to do with aliens? Right, let's get to that. So sometimes the aliens come because humanity has reached some sort of key technological milestone that gives us our initiation into an intergalactic community of sentient species. But typically when it's a benevolent alien invasion, there's more of a green man's burden attitude to everything. What I mean by that, it's usually the generous aliens giving us barbaric humans technology, or saving us from ourselves and our endless wars, that kind of thing. Some good examples of that include The Day the Earth Stood Still, Star Trek, First Contact, and Arrival. Arrival was adapted from a 70-page short story called The Story of Your Life, written by Ted Chiang. Some of the most notable changes from the source material include 1. Hannah's death. Instead of Hannah dying from an inoperable, unstoppable cancer, she dies from a climbing accident. I think the film was very smart to make this change because it stops a lot of the "why wouldn't she just stop her from going climbing if she knew what was gonna happen" kind of keyboard outrage. Number 2, the book focused heavily on the math and the science, as well as the written and spoken languages of the heptapods. There was more of a holistic view. Number 3, there's no bomb, there's no Chinese general threatening global war, and there's no grand explanation for why they were here. They just leave. Number 4, the movie holds back on a lot of crucial details until towards the end. For instance, in the opening scene of the script, it is explicitly clear that Louise is being asked by somebody off screen if she wants to have a baby. And number 5, there is a lot more ambiguity to the movie than there is to the short story. For instance, we don't know what Louise says to the general to make him change his mind. The screenwriter mentions in an interview that what she said wasn't as important as the recognition and shared understanding between her and the general, the kind of breaking down of cultural barriers that you really only ever see in alien invasion literature or movies. But because I'm super nosy, I looked it up. And for those curious, she says, "General, I'm calling from the American site. Your wife spoke to me in a dream. She said that you would save the world by being braver than everyone else. War doesn't make winners, only widows." While I did overall like this movie, there are a few things that could have been improved on. When you have a twist in this way, you have to set up Louise's character in a way that makes us, the audience, believe that she is grieving. And it comes across really well the first watch through. But when you watch it the second time, what do we really know about Louise's character? We know that she is a workaholic. That's about it. Makes it a lot harder to capitalize on these deep human emotional moments. Another issue would be the pacing. Once the initial suspense building has paid off, especially once we get to the info dump, the pace no longer feels suspenseful or even driven by the story. The pace feels sluggish, and it feels like we are being dragged to the next plot point. Finally, while there are themes that are obvious, it's kind of hard to figure out what the movie is trying to say. Typically, the philosophy of a movie is conveyed by having the character overcome a struggle. So when we look at what Louise has to overcome, what is that telling us? What exactly is the philosophy that they're trying to convey by having Louise make this huge decision without communicating to her partner? Is it that free will is worth the pain and suffering of your choices? Maybe. And part of that goes back to not knowing who Louise really is. It's ultimately not strong enough to convey a philosophy, and I think that weakens the movie as a whole. So, now that my griping is out of the way, let's get to some of the themes. Communication is the soul of this movie. When you don't have communication, things fall apart. A good example of this would be the lack of communication between Chekhov and the soldiers and the rest of the camp. All of that was motivated by fear and a vacuum of information. There's the communication between Louise and Ian. Throughout most of the movie, the communication makes them stronger as a team, and it helps them get closer and closer to uncovering what exactly the aliens are trying to tell them. But ultimately, it's the lack of communication between Louise and Ian from Louise's part that leads to the destruction of their relationship. And now, a tangent on Slaughterhouse Five and free will. The writer of the original short story, The Story of Your Life, Ted Chiang, noted in an afterword how he was heavily inspired by Slaughterhouse Five. And you can see the fingerprints of Slaughterhouse Five all over this movie. The design of the aliens within Arrival, for example, are like an upside-down version of the aliens within Slaughterhouse Five, the Tralfamadorians. Even the way they experience time is similar, if not identical. In fact, the main characters of Slaughterhouse Five and Arrival are extremely similar in the way that they are unstuck from time. They're both experiencing time out of order. But what's interesting to note here is the differences. Slaughterhouse Five, Billy Pilgrim, the main character, experiences his discombobulated sense of time because of this large amount of trauma and PTSD from his experiences in World War II. The attitude of the aliens in that story, the Tralfamadorians, and one that Billy Pilgrim adopts, is so it goes. It's more of a clinical acceptance of all the terrible things that happen to us in life. It is what it is. The philosophy of Slaughterhouse Five is largely rooted in fatalism, which is the belief that all things are predetermined and therefore inevitable. So it goes. This is going to happen. There's no stopping it. Therefore, no reason to be upset by it. That's just the way it was meant to be. Going back to Arrival, palindromes themselves are really tragic in this movie, as they are most associated with Hannah as a kid. The beginning and the end of her life, it's already done. Abbott, the alien who died, knew that coming to Earth was signing his death sentence. Abbott stays just a little bit too long trying to give this message to Ian and Louise, and he ends up saving them from the explosion that takes his own life. The question then becomes, was it his free will that drove him to continue on with this? Or was this an acceptance of his fate as he saw it? And while the main characters of both of these stories, Louise and Billy, are similar in that they know what's going to happen, there's a big difference in the motivation behind the characters. Whereas Billy's perception of time is a coping mechanism to deal with the trauma, Louise herself has an acceptance of the trauma because she's choosing it. When it comes to non-zero-sum games, I think it'd be more accurate to say that there is no winner versus everybody wins. And one could say the same for something like grief. In death, there is no antagonist, so to speak. Grief happens to you. There is no loser, there is no winner. You can't point to one thing and blame it. It is what it is. The mark of a decent movie, in my opinion, is rewatchability. Even better if the movie can reward you for rewatching with different Easter eggs or making the text of the movie mean something completely different after you've watched it for the first time. There's a reason that movies with a big twist are so popular. That rewatchability factor is strong. And when it comes to rewatchability, you definitely want to watch Arrival at least one more time. The Kuleshov effect is an effect demonstrated by Soviet filmmaker Lev Kuleshov, which basically says that we have much more meaning from a series of clips all put together versus individual clips. A good example of this would be Louise's initial monologue voiceover type deal. If we were to isolate the clips of Louise at the beginning just doing her job without any of the flashbacks or anything like that, we'd say it's a woman doing her job. But preceded by the life and death of her young daughter, we insert sadness that may not exist in the individual clips themselves. Rewatching the movie though, we understand the context of these clips. We know that the monologue, the voiceover in the beginning, is her reflecting on her new perception of time to the audience, which in this case is a theoretical Hannah. And when you think about it, the closest thing that we have to Louise's new perception of time is rewatching the movie a second time. When we know what's going to happen, everything takes on a new meaning. Knowing the end changes the way that we experience everything. And this opening shot, this is the moment where she chooses Hannah, knowing everything. And that's what makes it so beautiful and sad. She knows how much joy Hannah is going to bring to the world, but she also knows how much it's going to destroy her. Thank you so much for watching, and welcome to Flights of Fantasy. If you want to help support the show, please consider visiting the Patreon and becoming a patron. But if you can't do that, liking, commenting, subscribing, just engaging in the video will really mean a lot to me. Until next time, live well and stay curious.